The garage is quiet except for the sound of a pencil sliding across a piece of wood. It's Saturday morning. The coffee is sitting untouched on the workbench. There's sawdust on the floor, a half-finished project leaning against a wall, and a stack of printed plans with notes written all over the margins. You measure the board again. The cut looks right. The measurements seem right. But when you place the pieces together, something is slightly off. The joint doesn't line up the way you expected. The shelf sits uneven. And after another hour of adjusting, sanding, and trying to make corrections, you finally step back and realize the project you were excited about is becoming another unfinished piece taking up space in your workshop. And that moment is familiar to more woodworkers than most people realize. The frustration is not always caused by a lack of skill. Sometimes the real problem starts long before the first cut is ever made. Because what if the issue was never your ability to build? What if the problem was trusting plans that were never truly tested the way you expected them to be? Most people who experience this assume the problem is themselves. They think they need more experience, more confidence, better tools. Maybe they believe they simply are not as skilled as the people whose projects seem to come together perfectly. But after looking deeper into how many woodworking projects are approached, a different pattern appears. The problem often begins with the information people are using before they ever step into the workshop. I call this the information gap. It is the space between having a set of instructions and actually understanding what happens when those instructions meet real wood, real measurements, real materials, and real building conditions. Because there is a difference between a plan that looks complete on paper and a plan that has been created from an actual building process. Many woodworkers follow the traditional approach. They find a design. They download a plan. They look through measurements and diagrams. Then they start building. And at first, everything feels organized. But the challenges usually appear later. A measurement that was unclear. A step that assumed previous knowledge. A detail that was never fully explained. A part of the process that only makes sense after you have already made a mistake. And that is where frustration starts. Not because the person building lacks dedication. Not because they are incapable. But because they are trying to recreate a process without seeing how that process was actually solved. The difference is subtle but important. A woodworking plan is not just a list of dimensions. It is a guide through decisions. And when those decisions are missing, the builder is forced to solve problems that someone else should have already figured out. That is the hidden cost, the extra time, the wasted materials, the uncertainty, the constant question, am I doing this wrong, or was this never explained clearly enough? One of the most common situations happens when someone finds a project they genuinely want to build. Maybe it is a piece of furniture they have been looking for. Maybe it is something they want to create for their home. They save the design. They imagine the finished result. They start gathering materials. And everything feels exciting in the beginning. Then the first problem appears. The instructions move quickly through a step that seems simple to the person who created the plan. But for someone following along, it creates confusion. The plan says what needs to happen, but it does not always explain why. And that small difference changes everything. Because woodworking is not only about knowing where a piece goes. It is about understanding how the pieces work together. The builder pauses. They search for answers. They try to compare pictures. They make adjustments. And suddenly a project that was supposed to be enjoyable becomes a process of solving unknown problems. The internal thought usually sounds familiar. Maybe I just need more experience. But that conclusion is often wrong. The problem was not the person. The problem was incomplete guidance. Another situation happens when someone has already spent money collecting individual woodworking plans. One project here, another project there, a different source for another design. Over time, they accumulate files, folders, printed pages, and saved ideas. But instead of creating confidence, the collection creates another problem. Organization. Finding the right information becomes part of the challenge. Which plan should they trust? Which instructions are complete? Which projects actually match their current ability? The person may have dozens of ideas available, but still feel uncertain about where to begin. And this is where many people get stuck. They are not lacking motivation. They are not lacking interest. They simply have information scattered across too many places. The part nobody explains is that having more information does not always create more clarity. Sometimes it creates more decisions. And too many decisions slow everything down. The builders start spending more time searching than building. They think, maybe I need to become better at organizing. But again, the real issue is not effort. It is a system they're relying on. The third situation happens when someone starts a project with confidence, but the final result does not match what they imagined. The measurements look correct. The materials were selected. The steps were followed. But somewhere along the way, small uncertainties created small mistakes. A modification here, an adjustment there, a decision made without knowing the consequences. By the end, the project might still be usable, but it does not feel like what they pictured when they started. And that feeling can be discouraging, because woodworking is personal. People do not spend hours in their workshops because they want to create something ordinary. They build because they want the satisfaction of creating something themselves. So when the result falls short, many people blame their own ability. They think, maybe I am just not good enough yet. But what surprised me most was how often the same pattern appears. Different people, different projects, different workshops, same frustration. And here is what all these situations have in common. The problem is usually not the desire to build. The problem is not the willingness to learn. The problem is relying on plans that describe the destination without always showing a complete path. A successful woodworking project depends on more than measurements. It depends on having a clear process, a logical sequence, a resource that helps remove uncertainty before mistakes happen. And once you understand that, the way you look at woodworking plans starts to change. Because the question is no longer, why do I keep struggling with these projects? The better question becomes, what would happen if the plan already included the lessons learned during the build itself? After understanding this problem, the question became different. Instead of asking, how can I find more woodworking plans? The better question was, how can I follow a building process that has already considered the challenges before I encounter them? That shift changes the entire approach. Because the most useful woodworking resource is not simply a collection of designs. It is a structured system that helps someone move from an idea to a finished project with more clarity. The approach that changed everything was understanding the difference between a plan that only shows the final result and a resource built around the actual building process. When a project has been thought through from beginning to end, the instructions become easier to follow because they are organized around decisions a builder actually faces. This creates three important improvements. First, it reduces uncertainty. Instead of constantly wondering if you are interpreting a step correctly, you have a clearer path to follow. Second, it helps organize the learning process. Rather than collecting random plans from different places and trying to figure out which ones are reliable, everything becomes part of a more structured approach. Third, it creates consistency. Each project becomes an opportunity to understand the process instead of simply trying to copy an image. And this is the part that many people overlook. A woodworking plan is not valuable only because of the project it creates. It is valuable because of the problems it helps you avoid along the way. Think about the first situation we discussed. Someone starts a project, reaches a confusing step, and begins questioning their ability. A better structured resource changes that experience because the builder is not left trying to guess what happens next. The uncertainty is reduced before it becomes a mistake. Now think about the person with dozens of separate plans saved across different folders. The challenge is not a lack of ideas. The challenge is having a reliable place to organize those ideas and choose the right project with confidence. A structured library changes that relationship with woodworking. Instead of constantly searching for the next plan, the builder can focus on understanding the process and selecting projects that make sense. And finally, think about the person who finishes a project but feels disappointed because the result did not match their expectations. That experience often comes from missing information during the process. When the steps, measurements, and building logic are organized together, the person has a better understanding of how the pieces connect. The result is not perfection. Woodworking will always involve learning. Mistakes will still happen. But the difference is that the mistakes become part of the learning process instead of a result of missing information. This is why a complete woodworking library built around tested project plans can be such a different experience. The focus is not simply collecting more designs. The focus is having access to a resource that helps you understand what you're building and why each step matters. A good example is someone who has always wanted to build furniture, but has spent years saving ideas without completing many projects. The problem is not motivation. They already have the interest. They already have a desire. What they were missing was a clearer path between inspiration and execution. Once the process becomes more organized, the person can spend less time wondering where to start and more time actually working through projects. That is the difference between having information and having a system. At this point, there is usually one question people naturally ask. Does this really work for someone like me? And that is a reasonable question, because many people have already tried different resources before. They have downloaded plans. They have watched tutorials. They have collected ideas. And maybe those experiences did not create the confidence they expected. So let's address the biggest concerns. The first one, I am not experienced enough. This is one of the most common assumptions. People believe they need to become highly skilled before they can follow better projects. But the purpose of a good plan is to create understanding. It is not designed only for someone who already knows everything. A clear resource helps bridge the gap between where someone is now and what they want to create. The second concern, I do not have a professional workshop. Many people imagine that successful woodworking requires a large space filled with specialized equipment. But the foundation of a project is not the size of the workshop. It is understanding the process, knowing what needs to happen first, knowing what decisions matter, knowing how the pieces fit together. The third concern, I tried woodworking plans before and it did not work. This is where the distinction becomes important. Not every plan provides the same level of guidance. A simple set of measurements may tell you what something should look like, but a complete building resource focuses on helping you understand how to get there. The fourth concern, it sounds complicated. And this is exactly why structure matters. Complexity often comes from trying to solve too many unknowns at once. When the information is organized properly, the process becomes easier to understand, not because woodworking becomes effortless, but because unnecessary confusion is removed. The fifth concern, will this actually help me improve? The answer comes from looking at what improvement really means. Improvement is not only about building bigger projects. It is about making better decisions, understanding why something works, recognizing problems earlier, developing confidence through experience. That is how skills develop, not by avoiding every mistake, but by learning from a process that makes sense. The most interesting thing about this approach is that it changes the relationship people have with woodworking. It moves the focus away from chasing individual projects and toward building understanding. A person who has struggled with scattered plans may finally have a clearer way to organize their ideas. Someone who has hesitated to start may feel more prepared because the steps are easier to follow. Someone who has finished projects but felt uncertain may begin understanding why certain decisions matter. The transformation is not about becoming a different person overnight. It is about removing unnecessary obstacles. For example, imagine someone who has a small workshop in their garage. They have basic tools. They enjoy working with wood. But they often stop projects halfway because they reach a point where they are unsure about the next step. The issue is not their commitment. They are already spending their weekends learning and building. What they need is a clearer process. Or consider someone who has spent years collecting woodworking ideas. Their computer has folders full of saved projects. Their shelves contain printed instructions. But when they want to start something new, they still spend hours searching. The problem is not a lack of information. It is a lack of organization. These situations are common because many woodworkers are not struggling with the desire to create. They are struggling with uncertainty. And once uncertainty is reduced, woodworking becomes a different experience. You begin approaching projects with more preparation. You understand what questions to ask. You recognize what details matter. You stop feeling like every project is a completely new challenge. The core principle is simple. The best woodworking resource is not the one with the most projects. It is the one that helps you understand the process behind the projects. Because when you understand the process, Every project becomes a chance to improve. Now imagine where you are 6 months from today if nothing changes. The same saved ideas are still sitting on your computer. The same unfinished projects are still taking space in your workshop. The same questions appear every time you start something new. Which plan should I trust? Where do I begin? Am I missing something important? Not because you do not care, not because you are unwilling to learn, but because the information you're using has not given you the structure you need. Now compare that with a different approach. A place where projects are organized, where instructions are clearer, where the focus is not just a finished image, but the process that creates it. The difference is not about rushing. It is about making better informed decisions. The hardest part was never your effort. The hardest part was not having the right information organized in the right way. Looking back, many woodworking frustrations are not evidence that someone lacks ability. They are evidence that someone was trying to solve a complicated process without enough guidance. The time spent learning, measuring, cutting, adjusting, and try again was never wasted. That effort shows commitment. The missing piece was having a clearer system to support that effort. And once you understand that, the next step becomes much more natural. Instead of collecting more disconnected plans, you can focus on finding a resource that helps you understand the building process from beginning to end. If you want to see the resource I mentioned, I left it in the description. I would also like to hear your experience. Have you ever started a woodworking project that became more difficult than expected? Share your story in the comments. And if you enjoy practical woodworking discussions like this, consider subscribing for more videos focused on improving the way we approach building projects.